Good afternoon, all. Welcome to reinvent 2021. So good to see you all in person this year. It's my first reinvent as an AWS employee, and I'm amazed by the amount of energy this forum brings. So thank you for being here. My name is Manish Gilani. I'm the product manager for AWS Outposts team. I'm here to talk about AWS Outpost and how it may help you with some of your data residency goals. With me today, I have my awesome colleague, Shweta. She's from Amazon EBS. She's going to come later on during the presentation to talk more about how to implement or enforce data residency on Outpost. So to begin things, I'm going to talk about data residency. What does it mean from the application point of view? Then I'm going to dive deeper into AWS Outpost. What is AWS Outpost? What are some of its features and capability that may help you enable your data residency goals for your on-prem solution? Then Shweta is going to dive deeper into some of the policies that you can implement to enforce data residency and how to go about doing that. And then I'm going to cover a very interesting customer use case. Unfortunately, due to travel, our customer couldn't be here with us today, but they were gracious enough to share more details that I'm going to walk over during the last part of the presentation. So data residency, it's basically the requirement to process and store data in an IT systems that need to be contained in a specific geolocation. That geolocation could be a country, that geolocation could be a state, it could be a municipality, or it could be a set of buildings that you need to comply with. And typically we hear three main reasons that drive data residency. Usually there are regulatory requirements that require you, these are like businesses and public sector organizations that require the data to be resident in a particular location for legislative reasons. Then we have contractual agreements that customers have with their customers that want the data to not go beyond certain boundaries. And then we have corporate policies, information security policies, such as licensing terms that require you to retain the data in specific locations. So when you think about these aspects of data residency, before I dive into AWS Outpost, our general mantra at AWS is that if you can use a region for any of your workloads or applications, you should always first consider using a region for that purpose. It provides you more flexibility, elasticity. It gives you a wide gamut of integrated services for your workloads and applications. And within the guards of those high standards of privacy and security that we enable in region, AWS by itself is never going to move your data outside the region that you have stored the data in. You as a customer decide when you want to move the data to a different region for various reasons. It could be high availability, disaster recovery, or whatnot. Encryption is foundational to AWS. So all of our data is enabled, encrypted through high security chips like Nitro that you may have heard of. And I'm going to touch upon that in the later part of the presentation. But then on top of that, we also provide like Amazon Key Management Service to encrypt the data. And if customer wants to bring their own customer managed keys, we provide that flexibility as well. So this is all in spirit of enabling the security and the data residency. And then you also have access to a wide array of tools and services like identity management that help you enforce policies to be compliant to certain region. We have tools like CloudTrail that help you log and audit your data compliance for various reasons. And then we have a large network of security partners in AWS and also now as part of the Outpost Partner Ready program that can help you implement your compliant infrastructure. And so that's from the infrastructure point of view. But when we think out from the application point of view, we see three kinds of major applications from the cloud perspective. On the left-hand side, you have the region applications that are relatively easier to move to the cloud. These applications are typically the backend applications or SaaS applications that need to run on the mobile devices. And on the right-hand side, you have applications that are relatively harder to move for the right reasons. You have your local processing requirements, or you have to keep that data for data residency reasons. Local processing requirements could be for the media streaming applications, could be medical imaging, could be the workload that runs on a factory floor and need to sit right to the sensors. So these are the applications that you don't want to move to the cloud because typically they have close to 10 milliseconds sort of a latency turnaround time, and moving to a region may impact your workload performance. So that's what we hear our customers, that they want to keep that applications on premises. And then in the middle, you have applications that need to be resident for various reasons, such as regulatory, contractual, or corporate. And these applications can go either way. They can be on the cloud, or if we have a region or a local zone over there that I'm going to touch upon in a minute. But these applications, you have to decide whether, if the region, what your data residency parameters are. Can they go outside the building? Can they be in a local state, in a local country? Or they need to be resident definitely on premises. So that's where the customers decide what kind of data residency implementation they're looking at. And these, some of the examples for these applications are like the financial sector. We, for example, work closely with some of the banking customers. First, Abu Dhabi Bank is an example of a customer that we closely work with, who's enabling digital e-banking in UAE. To maintain the privacy of their data and the customers, they need to maintain the data within the UAE boundaries. We have manufacturing customers for the contractual terms for their customers, such as fabrication units and others. They need to maintain the data within the premises. And then finally, we have healthcare verticals, such as customer patient records or medical imaging, that require the data to be also maintained in a specific municipality or locality for data residency reasons. And when we talk to these customers tell us that they really want the flexibility, the scalability, the services and tools that cloud enables. But they have to now implement two different solutions, one for the services that they are willing to move to the cloud or they don't have the data residency restrictions, and the one that need to be resident on their premises. And three main challenges that they tell us that they come across is, one is the infrastructure enablement challenge. So on an average, procuring a hardware from different OEM vendors, testing and validating it for being ready for the production workloads, and then actually deploying it takes close to approximately 6 months. That's the feedback that we get from a customer, just from the infrastructure enabling point of view. Then the second challenge they run into is lifecycle management of that infrastructure. That includes the security, the patches, the upgrades. And that is a big time sink on their developers and resources to just keep the infrastructure up and running rather than developing the applications. And third is the most critical one that I personally care about coming from the developer side, is the developer efficiency. I don't want to use 3 different sets of API services tools, one for the cloud, one for the on-premises, or one for the applications that can stay anywhere in the middle. So it requires you to have a different set of services and tools and APIs to maintain that application. So the business impact is that you are spending a big set of your resources time to just maintain that 2 different set of resources. So to address that, when we think of the infrastructure from AWS perspective, we really want to bring the infrastructure where the customer is. So on the left-hand side, we have AWS regions, which, as you know, we are growing every year. So if a region is there where you want your data to be, then that's the most optimal place for you to reside your data. That's going to give you the maximum flexibility in terms of the services, in terms of the kind of infrastructure that you can deploy. Then on the right-hand side, we have infrastructure where it needs to be deployed in a rugged situations, in the middle of the sea, underneath the mines. So for that, we have capabilities such as Snow family of products, IoT Greengrass that helps you connect to the region when there is connectivity available. And then in the middle, which is the focus of the discussion today, is we have applications, the infrastructure like AWS Outposts that I'm going to spend the most time today. But then we also have AWS local zones. These are the large metro data centers where we have a significant amount of customers that want to maintain their data locally, or they want to run their applications for latency or local processing reasons. So you'll see that we are enabling a wide set of countries and US locations that will have local zones. And then we have AWS Wavelength that you may have heard of. AWS Wavelength is bringing AWS infrastructure near to the 5G edge. These are for the customers who are really latency sensitive and want to deploy the 5G applications near the edge of the carrier locations. So our focus today will be AWS Outpost. AWS Outpost is also a building block for local zones and wavelengths. So giving you a flavor of AWS Outpost will give you a sense as to what infrastructure is going into local zones and wavelength as well. So what is AWS Outpost? AWS Outpost, as I mentioned, the three key challenges, the infrastructure management, the lifecycle management, and finally the developer efficiency. So we heard that from the customers, and we came up with a solution with AWS Outpost in 2019, which we have been continuously improving every year. AWS Outpost is a fully managed service by AWS that provides the same infrastructure that we enable for our regions and other availability zones on your premises. That's one of the foundational piece of AWS, that we didn't want to have a different infrastructure for on-prem versus what we ourselves use in the region. Any delta difference introduces unpredictability in terms of the performance, in terms of the software services. So that's what the AWS Outpost, same infrastructure comes that we use in the region as part of the solution. It's fully managed, so that goes back to the challenge that the lifecycle management. So we manage the security patches, upgrades, any replacement that's needed. We maintain the inventory for any kind of a replacement that's needed. And it's monitored 24/7. And if there are any issues, we alarm the customer and tell the customers that this part is going bad and we'll be replacing it in XYZ timeframe. So that's the management aspect that customers really like about AWS Outpost. And third is, from the developer's point of view or monitoring point of view, is a single pane of management for both your regional resources and for your Outpost resources. As I mentioned, the customers have both sort of implementations. They have the on-prem implementation and the cloud implementation, and they don't want to manage it differently. So this provides a single pane of glass, which comes along with the same set of services, tools, and APIs. So customers don't have to use different APIs and tools. It's the same tools and APIs that you use to manage in the region that you can use on the Outpost. So this is how the Outpost rack looks like, the picture on the right-hand side. So when a customer is ready to consider an Outpost and they want to order it, we have made the process relatively very simple. Customer decides what configuration they want. The customers have to do some homework in terms of understanding what kind of workloads are they going to run. Is it a compute workload? Is it a memory workload? Is it a graphics optimized workload? So depending upon that, and then are you going to need object storage? So and we work closely with the customers. Our solution architecture team works closely with the customers to help them guide as to what infrastructure might be best suited for them. Once the customer is convinced on the infrastructure that's needed, they order a 42U rack. It comes fully assembled, ready to be rolled in your data centers. We do the site validation upfront to make sure that there are no late binding surprises, and it's ready to be provisioned in the space where you want the rack to be. The rack, the only thing that you need to be available on your site is the power and the network. One of the aspects of the on-prem servers that we have heard from a customer is very inefficient power management. Each of the servers have their own independent power bricks, and if you're running a large cluster, that makes it very inefficient. So all the goodness that we have implemented in region in terms of introducing power efficiencies, such as a redundant power conversion, a centralized way that converts your AC power to DC is implemented here. The network is provided by the customer, and we understand that network connection is a critical link between Outpost and connecting it to your on-premises. So we provide two redundant top-of-the-rack network devices so that if one fails, the other can all function. So customer can decide how they want to plug in their network infrastructure, but this comes ready to be provisioned with power and the networking, the only inputs that's needed. So that's from the hardware point of view, like what we provision. Now, in terms of the services, as I mentioned, the customers are running wide gamut of services online or on premises, and they want similar capabilities like they get in the cloud. So for that, we enabled Outpost with few foundational features like the EC2 instances that come with a compute, memory, or general purpose instances to suit various workloads. Storage is foundational to Outpost. So elastic block storage is de facto that comes with an Outpost. You decide how much storage configuration you want. We have various container services, elastic container services, elastic Kubernetes services that also are enabled to run locally on Outpost. This year, we heard a lot from our customers that from the data residency point of view, it's not just the primary data, it's a secondary data that also needs to be resident on the on-premises. So for that reason, we earlier this year launched EBS local snapshots. Shweta is going to dive much deeper into it, how to use it. We also, just a few days back, launched RDS backup. So we already had enabled RDS on Outpost, and now the customer also wanted to store the backup of their data on Outpost itself. So RDS backup is now generally available. One of the challenges that customer face is migrating their workload from their current on-prem solution to Outpost. So to help with that, we recently also enabled Cloud Endure on Outpost. So Cloud Endure is AWS data migration service that helps you migrate your data from any of your on-prem solution either to AWS Region or AWS Outpost. Previously, we had to go to the region and then put the data back to the Outpost. But then when we talk to the customers who are sensitive to the data residency reasons, they didn't want even temporarily the data to go outside their premises. So now with local snapshots, you have the Cloud Endure feature that enables that. And if you are following AWS Outposts, if it's of interest, then you may have also heard the VMware Cloud on Outpost. So a lot of our customers who are using VMware as their basis for their infrastructure, their software-defined data center, now we have enabled VMware Cloud on Outpost. It's a rack that comes fully provisioned with VMware capabilities. The same services, APIs, tools that you use on the VMware can be enabled on AWS Outpost. And the services piece is not just ending there. The services are continuously evolving, and we'll be happy to hear more feedback from you as to what other services would you like to be on the Outpost as well. Now, before we dive more deeper into the capabilities, one thing that we emphasize to our customer is that AWS works on a shared responsibility model. We always have a shared responsibility model in region with the customers where AWS is responsible for maintaining the security and the privacy of the data. So in that context, we are responsible for maintaining the hardware infrastructure, who has access to that infrastructure, and any kind of security patches, upgrades that are required to maintain that infrastructure. Customer is responsible for what operating systems they are running on top of that infrastructure, what applications they are running and who has access to those applications, and then the data, like how does customer wants to encrypt that data, AWS managed keys, customer managed keys. The thing that is different slightly on the Outpost is that we are now putting a piece of AWS in your data center. So that requires the customers to be responsible for the physical security of the asset. In that case, you want to make sure that you are controlling who has the access to the rack and making sure that it's physically secure. The second aspect is the networking. As I mentioned that in AWS Region, we are responsible for making sure that there is network connectivity and it's always on. If something goes down, we are responsible for keeping it up. Here, Outpost is working on customer's network. So you're responsible for making sure that there is always a network that's connected to the Outpost. And third is the capacity management. AWS regions are scalable, they're flexible. As your workload grows, you can continuously spin off new instances, and there's no issue with that. Outpost comes with depending upon the configuration that you ordered. So if you ordered a XYZ configuration, then you would have to be sure that your workload can maintain within that capacity. If you run out of the capacity, then you need to either kill some of the workloads and relaunch some of those instances, or you can always order a new outpost. We offer scaling up the outpost. Let's say you start with one outpost, and later on your workload grows, or you decide to move more applications that need to be data resident. More outposts can be connected as part of the same logical entity. But this is one place where we always advise customer to be cognizant of the capacity management, which is slightly different from how it is done in the region being an infinite scale. So I'm going to spend a few minutes diving into some of the capabilities that are specifically used for the enforcing data residency aspect. So from the security point of view, our customer told us when we told them that how we provision the racks in our data centers, our racks in our data centers don't necessarily have cages or locks because we are provisioning them. We are responsible for maintaining the privacy. Customers wanted, as we told them that you're responsible for the physical security, they wanted to be sure that they have all the tools on the racks to secure that. So AWS Outposts comes with a lockable door that you can control who has access to. The data on Outpost is always encrypted. It's not just the data in flight, it's the data at rest also. Whether it's stored on EBS or on S3 on Outpost, it's always encrypted. The device comes with a security key that's destroyable. If that security key is lost, then or if that security key is destroyed, then all the data is decommissioned. So I'm going to touch upon that in a minute in the next slide. And the data to the AWS region is always encrypted. Any data that's going from Outpost to AWS region is always encrypted by AWS. And then as I covered, the physical security is customer's responsibility. So today, I'm going to show you one of the innovation that we are doing in these kind of implementations like on-premises is called Nitro Security Key. Nitro Security Key allows us to extract the encryption hierarchy in one central place and then externalize it. So what it does is that typically when you have the rack or the server being decommissioned or you're replacing the servers, and data residency is of paramount importance to you. It's a cumbersome process to make sure that each drive is data is being destroyed properly, and which makes it a challenge when you have a rack or cluster of servers that need to do it again over and over again. So we at AWS came with a solution where we have externalized this key into one single hardware component. This hardware component has the hierarchy of encryption keys that are stored per server. So it's per server basis. And we can easily destroy all the data on the server by using one of the hex screw that sits on the top of the Nitro key that crushes the chip, which has part of the security key that's shared with a trusted platform module that's on the server. So this is just to show you the kind of innovation or how seriously we think about some of the security aspects that are relevant for our on-prem customers. And we are continuously thinking of how to bring more ease of management and simplicity on the Outpost devices. So this particular slide is going to briefly touch upon the networking aspects of AWS Outpost and how it helps with the data residency attributes. So on the left-hand side, we have AWS Region, which has a region can have various availability zones. The Outpost always needs to be parented to one availability zone. You decide which availability zone you want to parent it to. Once it's parented to that availability zone, you then have the flexibility to extend your regional VPC and its subnets to Outpost. So Outpost could simply be yet another subnet of your regional VPC construct. So you can then launch an EC2 instance in region on Outpost, and it looks like one big VPC cluster. Now, in this case, an EC2 instance can exchange the data with the region or with the Outpost. These are connected through a service link. The service link is the connection that we use to exchange the control plane information, any telemetry or health information of the service that we need. And that allows us to make sure that the Outpost is always in a healthy state. But then this is the same link that's used for the VPC tunnels to interact the data if you decide to do so. But we understand that that may not be the model for all the implementations specifically that are concerned about data residency. So we also allow the data to be resident, the VPCB to be just contained within an Outpost. You can have a VPC with its own individual subnet that reside on the Outpost with no bearing on the region. We will still have the service link connectivity with the Outpost so that we can keep the control plane functionality running, we can keep the telemetry information flowing, but no customer data would exchange hands with the EC2 instances that are running in the region, if you have some. So this slide is just to emphasize what I just said, that between AWS Region and Outpost, there is always some data that's exchanged via service link. This typically includes things like the telemetry information, the health of the state, the firmware that we need to upgrade. We have the system management calls that are being transferred from region to the Outpost just to make sure that if we have system upgrade patches that need to make sure that your server is running in the upgraded state, those are transferred. But then if you look at a particular EBS snapshot over here, these are only exchanged if you decide to do so. If you want the backup of your data to be stored in region, then you do so. And Shweta is going to walk through how that's enabled in more detail. But we give the tools and services to the user to decide what they want to move or what they want to keep on their premises. So to tie the things together, as I talked about, we have the AWS region on the left-hand side. AWS Outpost is a managed service from the regional perspective. It's connected to the Outpost through a private WAN connection. It could be a direct X connection that AWS has. That is then enabling the service link connectivity within Outpost, which has foundational services like EC2, block storage, the object storage, if you decide to do so. We have two networking devices, one of them being redundant to make sure that you have the redundancy to connect to your customer network. And then we have something called as local gateway. Local gateway is the construct that allows you to program how you want to direct the traffic. So local gateway is the construct of the networking device that allows you to specify the specific networking route tables or the customer-owned IP pools and what route they need to take. So that forms the overall structure of how things are connected. I'm now going to invite Shweta to talk more about how to go about implementing some of these data residency aspects and the storage attributes. Shweta.
Hi everyone, my name is Shweta Joshi and I'm an engineering leader at Amazon. Thanks Manish for introducing what data residency means and how you can use AWS Outposts to enable it. So today I'll be talking about some storage constructs on AWS Outposts and how you can use them to enforce data residency. So Amazon ABS is provided an Outpost for your persistent block storage needs. You can use the same GP2 volumes as in region as boot or data volumes. You can attach or detach them to your EC2 instances. Just as in AWS Region, EBS provides snapshot and restore capabilities and allows you to increase the volume size without any performance impact. As Manish mentioned, all EBS volumes and snapshots are encrypted by default. So persistent workloads on Outpost are useful for a variety of applications, ranging from databases to application servers that need you to do the local processing on-prem. We learned from the customers that this didn't solve all of their use cases. There were a number of applications that required local access to object storage for their local data processing needs or high throughput data transfer to reduce the total data transfer time between the customers, the outpost on the customer's network and in the AWS region. In order to fulfill the need for object storage, we introduced a new storage construct, S3 on Outposts. S3 on Outposts is designed to redundantly and durably store your data on Outpost across all the servers. Using EBS and S3 on Outposts, you can configure your data to remain local on-prem for your local data processing needs. It is also useful in a variety of applications that require high throughput local processing, such as medical imaging in hospitals or manufacturing processes. Till recently, we supported eventual consistency for S3 on Outposts. But our core tenet of Outpost is to be as close to region as possible. So S3 on Outposts now provides strong consistency. What that means is when you write a new object or overwrite an existing object, any subsequent reads will have the latest data. One of the questions that we get for S3 on Outpost is, where is my data actually stored? So just to reaffirm, your object data, your user metadata, system tags, everything is stored on Outposts. You can use the same console SDI API SDK features that you're comfortable with in region to interact with S3 on Outposts. You can use the same APIs to retrieve, store, and control access to your data. Amazon S3 on Outposts provides the same security and access control bar that you're familiar with and comfortable with in region. You can use IAM, that is Amazon Identity and Access Management policies, to grant or deny access to various identities like IAM users or IAM roles. S3 block public access is always enabled. What this means is any object stored in any of your S3 buckets on Outpost will not be publicly accessible. We provide S3 access points as a key mechanism to manage access across all your buckets. In addition to this, S3 object ownership is always enabled. What that means is the bucket owner is always the object owner, and any objects inside the buckets are always accessible to the bucket owner. We talked about how we can utilize block and object storage on Outposts. However, certain sectors of the industry, which are like highly regulated sectors such as manufacturing, financial, and healthcare, require not only the primary data, but also the secondary, the backup copy to be stored on-prem. For this, we introduced a new product called EBS Local Snapshots. For EBS Local Snapshots, you need your Outpost to be provisioned with S3. And you can control access to the EBS Local Snapshot using IAM policies. You can use local snapshots not only to store backups of your data, but also in cases of disaster recovery. So we talked about S3 on Outpost, EBS, local snapshots. And as data residency is paramount, as Manish mentioned, we need to manage our capacity. So how can we monitor it? You can use CloudWatch monitors to add alerts on metrics for S3 and EBS capacity. And then you can tune those alarms or monitors as according to your needs so that you can get alerted when your capacity is running low. We don't really think about these things in region as the capacity is very flexible. However, in Outpost, there's a finite amount of storage on the rack that you ordered. So now that we talked about different storage constructs, let's see how we can use Outpost storage for data residency. So this is an example of creating local snapshots on Outpost. If you have S3 on Outposts enabled and the volume is an Outpost, you see that while creating the snapshot, you'll get two options for your snapshot destination, AWS Region and AWS Outpost. So you can use this option for AWS Outpost to store your data locally. However, if you don't have S3 on Outposts, you can still control the backups from going back to the region by using IAM policies. I'll be going over that in a demo shortly. We can create snapshots not only from a single volume, but also from multi-volume snapshots from instances on Outposts. And by default, all volumes and snapshots are encrypted. So any volume that you create from a local snapshot must be encrypted with the same key with which the snapshot was created. So having all these capabilities on Outpost opens up a bundle of operations that you can now do. So you can now create armies from local snapshot. Armies are Amazon machine images used to launch the new instances. In addition to this, you can copy snapshot and armies from region to Outpost, and then launch instances based with those armies which are backed by local snapshots. The biggest benefit here that you get is you don't need to copy the image from region to Outpost anymore. In addition to reduced network bandwidth consumption, you also have reduced instance local processing times because you don't need to download the army. So let's see how we can enforce data residency using IAM. So IAM is Amazon Identity and Access Management that can be used to control the permissions on AWS accounts for IAM users, IAM roles, or any other identities while working with different AWS services. So this is an example of a IAM policy which is used to deny creating snapshots in region. So walking through this, basically we are using the effect deny, and then for actions create snapshot and create snapshots, and for any snapshot resources. So first condition returns true if the EBS volume is located on the outposts which we have mentioned. And second condition returns true if the destination is not an outpost. The outpost on is present only if the destination is an outpost. So by checking for outpost on not being present, we ensure that this policy is applied to any actions that are taken in region. So let's walk through a demo. We'll create the same policy that we used earlier. Okay. Yeah, got it working. As you can see now, here I've put the current snapshot, current outpost on. Now that the policy is created, we can attach it to our user for whom we want the policy to be enforced. And now that everything is set, let's try creating some snapshots. So here I selected a volume in region, volume on the outpost, sorry. And we'll be trying to create a snapshot with a destination as AWS region. As you can see, this fails because of our IAM policy that we created, which denies creation of snapshots on outpost to region. AWS CloudTrail is an AWS service that helps you audit your AWS account. Actions taken by users, roles, or AWS service are recorded as events in CloudTrail. So here we are seeing the CloudTrail log for the snapshot creation. CloudTrail is automatically enabled on your account when you create it. So we went through a couple of things with storage constructs, just summarizing them, EBS, S3 on outposts, and local snapshots. And you can tune them according to your needs. Every customer needs are different, and you can use each of these constructs to have fulfill your local data processing needs. With this, I'll invite Manish to talk about a customer use case. Thank you.
So we just looked at how to enforce the policies or to monitor that. Now I'm going to talk about FanDuel. FanDuel is one of our first customers for AWS Outpost, and it's a very interesting online betting platform that is allowing to reimagine the concept of fantasy sports. Who all play fantasy sports? Just a show of hand. Anybody? At least one person is there. So the fantasy sports, I personally like it because not for so much for the sports, it helps brings the people together, whether it's your old friends, college colleagues, or whatnot. So FanDuel is a bit personal as to how I really like this use case. So their challenge was that they're growing so fast, they wanted to accelerate their business across different US states. And they were running into an issue where the provisioning time was significantly large. The regulatory compliance required them to maintain the data in individual states where they're enabling their platform. And each of those platforms required procuring the data, testing and validating in that particular state, and then being production ready was taking anywhere close to 15 to 20 weeks. They had to pre-stage their environment on different services and then test the production workload. One of the biggest challenges was that they were really concerned about the amount of time it was taking for them to maintain that infrastructure, even after provisioning it. So they looked at AWS Outpost and all the things that we talked about, the management aspect of it, the same infrastructure. It's a cookie cutter. They wanted a cookie cutter solution that can be just replaced in every state that they're launching their businesses without having to go through different validation and production cycles. So the outcome that was from the business perspective that the workload that was taking anywhere close to 15 to 16 weeks now was reduced to 20 days. And these 20 days are coming largely from our side because we need to go validate the site. We need to make sure the right hardware is landing. But that's the significant reduction they saw. The other piece was the 30 to 40% improvement in the application performance because now there was no major differences in the hardware they were provisioning. It's the same hardware that's landing in state X versus state Y. So that helped them have the same uniform performance across their platforms. And then the amount of the operational expense saving that they got because now they didn't have to manage the infrastructure and the developers were now building the capabilities that they want to offer for enabling the fantasy sports. So we couldn't have our guest speaker today, but Shane Sweeney, who's the VP of IT for FanDuel, shared a video that I'd like to share with you guys.
FanDuel is aiming to be the #1 brand for sports betting in the US. One of our key objectives is launching new sports betting opportunities in every US state. And with that comes a requirement to build on-premise data centers to deal with the regulatory aspect of our industry. A key challenge for FanDuel is making sure that we adhere to our regulatory obligations and our data residency obligations. We have to deploy and ensure our customer data is protected and stays within a given state. And by using AWS Outposts, we are deploying and ensuring that the data is as close to where we need it to be from a performance perspective and a customer stability perspective, whilst meeting all of our regulatory obligations. AWS Outposts as a key technology really enables us to cookie cutter the deployment and makes it easier for us to pre-stage our environments. We're in test and development. And when we are ready to install by working with our regulators, we can very quickly deploy production-ready instances of all of our software and platforms by using all of the standardized tools that AWS has to offer. We've managed to increase our overall productivity and decrease our time to market from a process that was taking between 15 to 16 weeks down to a process that takes less than 20 days from the point at which the hardware is installed by the AWS engineers. Because we have less work to do to stand up the infrastructure platforms. And that ultimately means we can work more closely with our regulatory colleagues to ensure that we are abiding by the various rules and regulations that brings responsible gaming to where FanDuel feels it should be. The more we utilize the AWS Outposts devices, the more we realize that we can create more efficiencies within our application environments. What we're seeing is that overall our latency between our applications has been completely optimized such that we are seeing 30 to 40% performance improvements by running on more standardized hardware in AWS Outposts than the comparable off-the-shelf vendor hardware that we had been using previously. By using AWS Outposts, AWS are taking on the management of the day-to-day operation for our infrastructure and our hardware platforms, and that allows FanDuel engineers to focus on building and delighting their customers with all of the new products that we are set to launch. Now that AWS Outposts is available, we will continue to migrate all of our on-premise OpenStack and VMware environments to AWS Outposts.
So thanks to FanDuel for sharing their story. And we expect this story to repeat for other verticals as well. That's the same problem statement that other verticals also have. And we expect that with the feedback that we're going to get from our customers as to what other features they'd like to see, we're going to continue evolving our use cases for other verticals as well. So to summarize, from the management perspective, AWS Outpost gives you the maximum flexibility on premises to reduce your operational pain, have the same infrastructure that you have in cloud in your premises, so that the same services, tools, and APIs, you're able to manage the same infrastructure with a single pane of glass. With the storage services that Shweta walked through, we have EBS and S3 on Outpost that allow you to store your primary data. And as we discussed, some of these customers also require, for the regulatory reasons, the backup data to be stored on Outpost. So the EBS local snapshots enable you to store not just the block storage data, but also the armies that can be stored locally for launching the instances. All data security is #1 tenet for AWS, and same is true for Outpost. It helps, we keep the data encrypted by default, data in flight and data at rest. And then we want to give you the tools and services for you to build your compliant infrastructure. And that comes through things like identity management tool, CloudTrail, CloudWatch capabilities. So I will highly encourage to visit our kiosk. We have AWS hardware at the AWS Village. look at it up front. It gives you a real feel of what that hardware is and how it looks in your data center. And then there's a selfie challenge also going on, so take some good selfies with the hardware and post it on Twitter. I don't know what the prize is. I'm going to find out myself after going there. And these are some of the additional sessions that are happening at the reInvent. You can watch live or during the replay. And some of them are going to dive deeper into some of the Outpost capabilities, how you can implement your high availability solution using Outpost, as well as some of the use cases in more detail. We just covered one in detail, and there are sessions that are going to walk through other verticals, how they're using Outpost. So thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. Myself and Shweta and our colleague from EBS will be off stage to answer any questions. And hope you have a good rest of the reInvent. Thank you so much.